Namaskar to all of you. Thank you for being here. This is a series on Sri Aurobindo's book, Synthesis of Yoga. And we have been exploring the section on Jnana Yoga, yoga of integral knowledge. And the exploration of this section started with first shedding light on what is the object of knowledge on path of Jnana Yoga, which is the Tapas Shakti. Then Sri Aurobindo lays down certain milestones on the path of Jnana Yoga. First being the right thought, the second being an experience or a vision, and third is that absolute vision of Jyotirmaya Brahman. And then in this section, Sri Aurobindo talks about the three foundational elements, which are purification, concentration, and renunciation. And he redefines the meaning of these words for us. And then he talks about the importance of release from being subjected to the body, to the vital, to the mind. A release from being subjected to these three aspects of human living, not with the intention of escape, but with the intention of reclaiming one's infinite potential and reclaiming one's position as the master of nature. Because when we identify for the body and we feel like we are this body, when we are subjected to the body consciousness, very often it brings a certain limitation, a certain ignorance. And in process, we forget about our infinite potential. And hence the importance of a release from this subjection to the body. Same with the prana or the vital. When we identify ourselves with the dual emotions of satisfaction, dissatisfaction, attraction and repulsion, joy and sorrow, love with attachments or anger, our heart tends to mirror this dual emotions. But there is a possibility when we release ourselves from being subjected to the prana, of mirroring in the heart the deep, the intense, the calm, the universal, unconditional love of the divine. And hence the importance of release from being subjected to the vital. And then the same with the mind, because the mind tends to build up its own sense of the truth, its own mental constructs of who am I, who is God, who is this world, what am I here to do, what is right, what is wrong, what are the ideals. But if anything, these are just one of the rays of the true divine, which is more like a sun or like a Jyotirmaya Brahman. And if we truly are a seeker of yoga and Jnana Yoga, which is discovery of the true knowledge and the Tapas Shakti, then it is important not to identify with one ray. It's important to separate oneself from that and seek the true sun. So having laid down the importance of a release from the subjection from mind, body and vital, Sri Aurobindo also talks about the process of release, which is a combination of an affirmation and the process of observation. And we can go through that process together. First, Sri Aurobindo talks about the body, that this is not myself or thyself. This is one working of the Prakriti. Stand back from it. And if we close our eyes and we go through the experience of telling ourselves that this is not myself or thyself, this is one working of the Prakriti, and we stand back from it, there is a capacity to observe the feelings arising in this body. And the key to the process of observation is neither to get affected nor to interfere with the process. So this is not myself or thyself, this is one working of the Prakriti. Stand back from it. And then one does the same to the vital. I am not this satisfaction or dissatisfaction, this high or low, this expansion or contraction, this appreciation or criticism, this anger or joy. These are one workings of the Prakriti in the sensational and the emotional mind. And as one observes, gradually one develops a capacity, a separation, a deeper sense of calm, where these dual emotions fall on the surface. One tends to get reabsorbed in these dual emotions only to come back for the calmness to deepen, and eventually this calmness transforms into an all-embracing, loving compassion of the divine. And same can be done to the thought mind as well. That I am not this thought, I am not this thinker, I am not this doubt, I am not this judge, I am not this right or wrong. This is one working of the Prakriti in the thought mind. And one again observes the thought mind and gradually develops a capacity to silently observe all these three. But still there is something that remains of the ego in us, despite the release from these three. And that is the topic of this chapter, which is the release from the ego. A release from the ego, where ego means I am here. Ego means a sense of control. I am here, I am something, and I seek my fulfillment. And whenever this thought arises in us, it immediately creates a conflict in the being. A conflict, on one end we seek our own fulfillment, and on the other end there is a subtle understanding that one is meant in human living to win over the ego so that one can experience the communion with the divine, experience the divine delight, the light, the strength, and the love of the divine. So there's one part of us which wants to seek upwards, and there is one part of us which wants to fulfill oneself here. So it leads to a vertical conflict in our being. And then, as we feel like this ego, there is also a horizontal conflict that comes in the being, which is a part of us seeks our own fulfillment, but there is also a part of us which identifies with a family, with a community, with a race, with a nation, with humanity at large, with the world. And as it identifies with different forms of collective, it feels that it is also one of the basic needs to fulfill this whole collective as well. I must take care of my family. I must take care of my nation. So there is a horizontal conflict. Do I fulfill myself? Do I fulfill the nation? Do I fulfill my family? So the moment I am here, I am this, there is this conflict, a vertical and a horizontal conflict that we face. And there is only one thing which reconciles this conflict, that is expansion of the being. The more we expand, the more likely it is for us to value each of these equally. The more likely it is possible for us to come up with creative solutions where we value each of these equally. One of the most simple and practical ways of expansion is gratitude. When we thank the divine for the connection that we have with the divine, there is an experience of expansion. There is more unition with the divine. There is more love, light, strength that comes from the divine. When we thank for our experience in the here and now, then it brings fulfillment to us in the present moment. We enjoy what is there in front of us in the present moment, not the ego seeking out for fulfillment in the future, but there is gratitude for what is there in the present moment. It brings expansion in the here and now. When we are grateful for the power of inclusiveness, when we are grateful to the power of endurance, then it brings an expansion of the being, and we are inclusive of every element or every collective which is around us and beyond, and also inclusive of every element in us. So this is one simple way of expansion, and as we expand, one can transcend the vertical and the horizontal conflict. And Sri Aurobindo describes this contraction and expansion through these words. The ego is by its nature a smallness of being, a contraction of consciousness, and with contraction a limitation of knowledge. When we feel contracted, it brings a certain ignorance. And that brings a diminution of power, and by that diminution, incapacity and weakness. So when we feel contracted, there is a ignorance, lack of knowledge, and that brings a lack of power, a sense of incapacity. I cannot do this, I cannot do that, I'm weak. And that brings a scission of oneness and disharmony, a failure of sympathy, love, and understanding. And when we feel this incapacitated, limited being, then it brings a separation, a lack of that oneness. And that brings a failure of sympathy, love, and understanding. And that brings a fragmentation of the delight or bliss of human existence. And that fragmentation brings pain and sorrow. To recover what is lost, we must break out of the walls of ego. The ego must either disappear in impersonality or fuse into a larger I. It must fuse into the wider cosmic I, which comprehends all the smaller cells, or transcend, of which even the cosmic self is a diminished image. So one must break through the walls of ego and expand and fuse with the cosmic I, the universal I, or transcend the universe and the individual and merge with the supreme I beyond this universe. And that is a true release of the ego. But what very often happens when we break the walls of individuality, what happens when we try to expand is very often we expand and identify ourselves with the collective. Rather than expanding to the cosmic I, we expand and experience, I feel one with all humanity or all human beings. And then I serve all human beings. Altruism, philanthropy, service. But one needs to realize that this putting one's own individual needs lesser and giving more priority to the need of the collective is more of a mental or a moral ideal. In the human society, it's considered very noble to live for the humanity, for the progress of the humanity, which sounds very nice, but it doesn't mean a release from the ego. Because humanity at large is only a collective sum of individual egos. If anything, especially if one is a sadhak, then sometimes this collective humanity consciousness is less evolved than the individual. So one must be vigilant of embracing these mental and moral ideals which seem noble, seem more expanded, but yet are not a complete release from the ego. And hence we must break the walls of the individual ego and also the collective ego of humanity and expand beyond that and merge with the cosmic I. And that brings us to the process of the release of the ego. Having looked at the vertical and the horizontal conflict and the importance of expansion, and the importance of expansion not just beyond the individual but also beyond the collective humanity, we come to the process of release from the ego. And if we close our eyes and we go back to what we just did in observing that I am not this body, this is not myself, this is not thyself, this is one working of the Prakriti, and one stands back from it. I am not even these dual emotions. This is one working of the Prakriti in these senses and the emotional mind. And we observe that. And I'm also not these thoughts or the thinker. And we stand back from that and observe these three. There is something which still remains. A something which is undefinable. A something which doesn't feel like the body or the mind or the prana, but something on which these three depend. And that something undefinable doesn't support itself on the individual or the collective, but actually is a kind of a mental power which supports itself on the Purusha or the true witness. So this undefinable is like a shadow of the Purusha. It is still limited. And very often one feels, having embraced this undefinable, one feels that there has already been a release from the ego. But this is still a shadow. And one must observe the shadow. Again, not interfering with the shadow. And as one observes the shadow, one can go beyond the shadow and merge with the true Purusha. One may call it the Jivatman, of whom this is just a shadow. And this Jivatman is a reflection or a spark of the true infinite spirit beyond this universe. And this Jivatman has a ease of communion with this supreme, transcendent, divine. And in many systems of yoga, the buck stops here. One has discovered the Jivatman. One has discovered the connection with the Supreme. Now it is all about living in this connection and limiting one's activities to what's absolutely necessary and seeking a liberation from cycle of birth and death. But in integral yoga, one goes one step further. And Sri Aurobindo describes that one step further through these words. If the highest height of spiritual experience, the sheer summit of all realization, is the absolute union of the soul with the transcendent, the widest scope of that union, so the discovery of the Jivatman and the highest scope is to discover its connection with the supreme transcendent divine. But the widest scope of this union is the discovery of the very transcendent as the source, support, continent, informing, and constituent spirit and substance of the divine existence and nature. What that means is that if the highest possibility is a connection or a communion between Jivatman and the Supreme Divine, the widest possibility is to realize that this Supreme Transcendent Divine beyond this universe is also the source of this universe. And it is not just the source of this universe, it is also the support of this universe. And it is not just the source and the support of this universe, it is also the informing spirit of this universe. It constantly reflects on this universe. And it is not just the source, not just the support and the informing spirit, it is also the very substance of this universe and the essence of every individual. And this is something which breaks down the walls of the mind, because the mind cannot process all this. But when we de-identify from the mind, we de-identify from the ray, and we go towards the Jyotirmay Brahman, there is a possibility of this supreme experience and the widest experience. And as one experiences this, it brings a certain calm and bliss to us. And we all have a possibility of experiencing this, even if we have not entirely purified ourselves, we have not gone through the entire process of concentration, renunciation, a release. But the cords of emotions and mind have loosened enough from the Jivatman, then the Jivatman can snap the main cords and experience these heights and widths or the breadths of the experience. And as it comes down back again into our day-to-day life, there is a possibility of a cloud or a wheel coming in between. And as we again get into our work, the same old patterns, the same old habits, the same old ego, that unconsciousness again taking over and going in the same habitual nature. So what happens to the sadhak very often is that as they progress, they develop this capacity for this experience of transcendent and the widest, only to come back and then again be in that unconscious mold of old habits. And there is a kind of a cloud in between. But through every ascension and every descent, slowly and slowly, progressively, each impurity is purified. And eventually, Sri Aurobindo describes that the impersonalized jiva, one with the universal and possessed by the transcendent, lives high-seated above and looks down undisturbed at the old workings of nature. He cannot be moved by the three modes of Prakriti, nor can he be shaken from his station by grief and suffering. And finally, there is no wheel in between. The higher peace overpowers the lower disturbance and mobility. And the soul can take a sovereign possession of itself above and below and all together. So these are, of course, the eventual goals of what we are looking at. But one can look at it with an analogy of a ladder. a step ladder which starts from our house, and at the bottom of the ladder we are looking at our own house, our own life. What do I need to do today? What is all around us? And as we keep climbing the ladder, there is purification, there is release from the body, there is a release from the mental, and one can look from the roof of one's house, the houses all around. If there is a further release from the indefinable and the impersonal, one goes higher and higher up the ladder, and there is a whole city view to life. It's a very different experience. Only for us to come down the ladder again into our house and forget about that city view and again be caught up in our own daily workings of life. But every time we ascend and we descend, the more we ascend and we descend, the more that memory of that city view stays with us, even in the house. And gradually one can find that intermediary position on the step ladder, from where there is an easy access to the city view, and at the same time one can function in one's day-to-day life, whatever task has been given to one by that city view. And that is what Sri Aurobindo very often refers to the psychic being, or a position seated high above the head. So to summarize, in this chapter on release of ego, we first looked at the importance of release, because there is a vertical and a horizontal conflict in us. Do I serve the divine? Do I serve my own interests? Do I serve my own interests, or do I serve the interests of the collective? And the way to transcend that is expansion. A practical, simple way of expansion for all of us is gratitude, which helps us build up those little steps towards the release from the ego. But a complete process of the release of ego calls out for breaking the doors of the individual I, breaking the doors of the collective I of humanity, and merging with the wider cosmic I. And the process entails first a release from physical identification, then a prana identification, then a mental identification, and then not to get lost in the illusion of the undefinable, and going beyond the undefinable and merging with the true Purusha or the Jivatman. And from there, merging with the Supreme Divine, and from there having the widest possible experience of seeing this universe being sourced and supported and being contained in that transcendent divine. And finally, having the courage to come back into this world, descend, and work consciously and sincerely, and then go through those ascents and descents to purify each and every impurity, to be eventually seated high above as the Jivatman, who is ultimately not affected and is equally endurant and equally impartial, and carries the dynamic delight of the divine. Thank you. Akhanda mandalakaram vyaptam yena characharam tatpadam darshitam yena tasmai shri guruve namaha. Ajnanam timiram dusya jnananjanam shalakaya chakshur unmilitam yena tasmai shri guruve namaha. Gurur Brahma, Gurur Vishnu, Gurur Devo Maheshwara, Gurur Sakshat Param Brahma Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Sir, would you like to add something?
After that beautiful Guru Vandana, actually it's not very appropriate for me to add anything. So maybe I can neutralize that uneasiness that I feel of continuing after the Guru Vandana by continuing with another Guru Vandana. Dhyanamoolam Guror Murti Pujamoolam Guru Padam Mantramoolam Guror Vakyam Mokshamoolam Guru Kripa. The topic that Dr. Mankul Goyal has discussed today is the release from the ego. Ego is a much maligned entity. We feel it's an evil which somehow happens to be there and we have to kill it. That is the general feeling in spiritual circles. Now first let's see what it is and why it has been planted there. Ego is basically an awareness of myself being a distinct individual. It's an ego sense, a sense of I-ness and my-ness. And the reason it has been planted is because that is how the individual is able to pay exclusive attention to his own basic needs. And that becomes necessary because although we have three instruments to take care of those needs, the physical, vital and the mental, that is the body, the emotional part of the being and the intellect, these three are themselves at war with one another and therefore they need some unifying force which may not be all-knowing and all-powerful like the divine, but can serve some sort of a housekeeping function. And that is why the ego has been planted there, because otherwise it could quite happen that the individual without this ego will neglect even his basic needs and will take recourse in just doing nothing, and the emotional part of the being may motivate the person to say, seek food and so on, which are necessary, but then there will come in the dominance of the tamasic or the inertia, which is a basic characteristic of the body, and there may come in the mind which may start justifying some of this laziness, and the result could be that the individual could become lazy. So the ego sort of keeps them together to some extent, the way the Prime Minister has a cabinet. Here also the ego is the Prime Minister and it has this cabinet of these three parts of the being, and the result is that we are able to function in the ordinary world, and it is because of this ego that we are able to take care of our basic needs. That applies to the animal, that applies to man, but then in the human being, because of a better intellect, what has happened is that the function of the ego does not remain just to sort of keep these three parts of the being, the three instruments, together so that they keep working towards the survival of the individual and the reproductive function and so on. The man, because of his intellect, has not only different aspirations and needs, the ego itself also has acquired a different dimension. It is not confined to just my being a distinct individual and therefore taking care of my survival. It also acquires other functions or other dimensions rather, that I am superior to others, my views are more correct than those of others, I can, because of the qualities that I have or the opportunities that I have, I can accumulate more and more resources from the environment, and that becomes an extension of my ego, and that leads to an aggrandizement of the ego, a bigger house, a bigger car, better furniture, better clothes, and so on and so forth. Now all that becomes an extension of the ego, which animals don't suffer from. And this is what leads to, in addition to the ego sense, the same element acquires what we call a dimension of egoism. So it's not the ego sense which is so much at fault. It is the egoism that develops because of our superior mind, which probably the animals don't have this sort of an egoism. They just have an ego sense that in the human being it acquires all the negative connotations. But then the human being also has an intellect, and this intellect can go a little further and say that, well, you are important, but at the same time others are also important. They also have an ego. And therefore, if you have to function as a group and interdependence and relationships are important to us, then we have to control this ego. Now, this is something a child learns pretty early in life. The child develops the ego, which is important. The child also learns to control the ego, that if I don't follow the rules of the game, others will not play with me. So that's why I can't be batting all the time. I also have to bowl. I have to do the fielding also. So that's what the child learns, and controlling the ego. But then as the intellect develops further, or in those in whom the intellect goes beyond just this ego control, the person also realizes that if I have been able to have additional opportunities because of which I have additional wealth or additional power or additional knowledge or whatever I should share it with others. So this feeling of sharing also comes, that working for the collective good is important and is more important than working for just one's individual good. Now, this is what leads also to activities, as Mankul mentioned some time back, to things like altruism, philanthropy, charity, and so on. And this is all considered very noble in the human world. And it's not wrong. Sometimes, people have this feeling that Sri Aurobindo and the mother were against such activities. They were against social work. They were not against it. But what they were sort of trying to point out was that when it is done at the mental level, which is the dominant trend in the modern world, because, Europe went through that secularization, and when it started, and then the result was that it returned to some ethical behavior, but that ethical behavior was not rooted in religion, it was rooted in rationality. So when it got rooted in rationality, then came up these ideas that the collective good is important, and therefore the individual should sacrifice some of his own individual welfare for the sake of others. Now, this was a rational idea, and it is not bad. Sri Aurobindo and the mother are not against it, but what they have pointed out is that this arises from a mental calculation, from a mental view, and therefore we still remain rooted in error. So we don't have to kill the ego. What we have to do is to eliminate the error which is inherent in the ego. And the inherent error is that ego by nature is a restrictive tendency. And therefore, even when we widen it to include others more and more, when we widen it, that basic restriction still remains, and therefore the person continues to feel that I am the one who is keeping in mind the welfare of others, I am doing this, I am doing that, and therefore very often these activities like philanthropy and charity and so on are associated with that egoism. So in fact, in one way the ego is getting controlled, in the sense that I'm controlling my own needs, even making some sacrifice for the sake of the larger good. But a subtle and more deadly form of ego is taking its place because of this feeling that I am doing it and therefore I'm a good person, and therefore it's translating into an egoism. So now what is the solution? The solution to this is that instead of the ego giving way to egoism, which not only aggrandizes the ego and therefore actually makes the person sometimes more arrogant, but it also has other drawbacks, because then the person starts feeling that if I'm doing this, then things should change, the world should change, the world should become a better place, all these social evils against which I'm trying to work, like poverty and hunger and so on, they should disappear, he starts measuring the objectives and the outcomes objectively, and if he's disappointed, he feels, well, if all that is not happening, at least these people for whom I'm doing something, they should be grateful to me, but they're not grateful, so he's again disappointed. And the result is that he actually may be doing a lot of good to the world, but he continues to suffer. Mentally, he is not still at peace. And that is because the ordinary ego sense still remains, and if anything, it has now acquired another dimension, the dimension of egoism. Now, how does this error get eliminated? Through knowledge, because error is rooted in ignorance. And what is that knowledge? The knowledge is that we came from, it was told, from the same source. In fact, everything is the same substance. So all the creation is, in fact, in its essence, one. So it's the sense of oneness which is rooted in a wider knowledge, a deeper knowledge and a higher knowledge that can correct this error, and we may be doing the same activities but from a different point of view. The person may still be doing charity, they still may be doing things which are philanthropic or altruistic in nature, he may be doing social work, but now he's doing it from a different point of view. And what is that different point of view? Earlier it was just an expansion, horizontal expansion, as was pointed out. It was, the ego was expanding horizontally. Now it is also expanding higher and deeper. So that vertical expansion has started. And that is the result of this oneness. And now when the person is indulging in these activities, the so-called good activities, it does not lead to that egoistic feeling. The person is doing it because the person can see the divine in those who are, for whom he is doing it. So he's not doing it for them, he is doing it for the divine in them. So that's another sort of way of looking at, rather the proper explanation for another thing which sometimes is looked at very superficially in integral yoga, that integral yoga is not for man, it is for the divine. It's not that we don't have to do anything for man in integral yoga, what may be called social work or altruism and so on. But in integral yoga, we do it not for man, but for the divine in man, for the God in man. We are doing it for that. So when you do it that way, then it is because of that oneness which you realize, and that oneness is based not just on a mental sort of a feeling that, well, we are all interrelated and therefore this is good and this is bad. It's not based on a sense of good and bad, it is based on a sense of a wider and deeper and higher knowledge. So it's the consciousness that has changed. It is not because we are trying to do something good so that everything that is bad can be eliminated from the world. It is not looking at it in terms of good and evil, it's looking at it from that angle. Do we get some training for it even in the ordinary course of life? That also is actually planted in us. The only thing is to carry that process further. Say, when a boy falls in love with a girl, the person gets married. Now, what is happening is that the teenager who was basically all absorbed in me, mine and myself has included in that ego circle at least one more person. And then come along the children and there are a few more. And the circle can sometimes widen still more. In India particularly, we have extended families. Now in those cases, when the circle is expanding, as the circle expands, it is not just because the person feels that uneasy that if I don't do something for them, that's not good. It's not the way social work is done. It is not only not done even as a mere responsibility, that now it has become my responsibility to take care of these people. It is also done without any calculation, out of genuine love. So that is why it becomes easy. If it is to be done only as a responsibility, as a duty to be done, it will be a burden to carry. Why it does not become a burden to carry is because of an inherent love. And what is love? Love is rooted in oneness. So it is because that sense of oneness has been, is at the root of this type of relationships, which are a part of the normal life cycle, that you do not do it as a result of that mental activity which leads to philanthropy. It does not result from a sense of responsibility which may come from social norms. It goes beyond that, and therefore neither feels like a burden, nor does it inflate the ego. It doesn't lead to that same sort of egoism because I'm doing something for my child or my partner or my parents or so on. It doesn't lead that. So that is built in. Now, if the same attitude of doing it out of love, because of that inherent oneness which is rooted in deeper knowledge and higher knowledge, if that same process were responsible for expanding this circle further, then it will lead to spiritual growth, further spiritual growth. Spiritual growth is happening also in the process of parenting and so on. So those are also opportunity, but that's the beginning, that's training. When the person has a training of for 10, 15, 20 years, then the person has become an expert. Now the person can also do it without having that sort of worldly relationships for others, but rooted in the same type of love which is rooted in oneness. So when the person starts doing that, because of that higher knowledge, then the circle expands, but the egoism doesn't come in. And as the circle expands, if it includes everyone, then the circle has essentially disappeared. That is what Aurobindo calls the undefinable. Now the ego becomes undefinable. But the undefinable is not necessarily also the infinite. Because the infinite goes even beyond the undefinable. It is sort of a more, firstly, a clear perception of all being one, and also a sense of the transcendent. Because the infinite includes also the transcendent, which is beyond all creation. So that's how the undefinable is again a step towards the infinite. Undefinable is good. But then this undefinable is the result of this expansion of the ego circle, which is rooted in oneness rather than a conscious decision because I want to do some good to the world. So the activities remain the same, but whether they will end up expanding the ego and also giving it a higher and deeper dimension so that the effects of egoism will not come in, or whether it will be done out of a limited mental calculation at the rational level, which will lead to a lot of good to the world but will not help the individual much. He'll still not be at peace, and still he will be thinking in terms of me and others. And in fact, the ego sense would have been replaced by its more deadly version, and that is egoism. So it's basically sort of, if I were to sum up, we have to distinguish between the ego sense, which has been planted with a purpose, and egoism. And release from the ego comes when we go to the root of ego sense itself and realize its limited purpose, and see that basically this sense was planted with a purpose, but if we can serve the same purpose by looking at it, rather looking through it and seeing that it had a limited purpose, it has served its purpose, now it can be shed. I can continue to look after my individual needs, but at the same time I can also see the oneness which I have with others. So when that can be done, then one has acquired a sort of a release. One has been able to achieve a release from the ego. So what we need is a release, most importantly from egoism, and if possible also from the ego sense, and that will come only if we are able to not just expand horizontally, but also vertically, higher and deeper, and that is what will give us the true release from the ego. As Patanjali says, avidya, asmita, raga, dvesh, abhinivesha, klesha. That is the avidya, ignorance, the ignorance of the deeper truths of existence is what leads to asmita, the ego sense, and that in turn is responsible for the other sources of conflict, raga, dvesh, and abhinivesha, that is the likes and dislikes, liking and disliking people, liking and disliking events and circumstances of life, and abhinivesh, that is fear of death. Now all these are basically rooted in the ego sense, and the ego sense in turn is rooted in avidya or the ignorance. So the basic thing is to work, use the knowledge that we have, the actions that we do, and the devotion that we develop towards the divine, because basically all these three basic instruments, the head, heart, and the hands, which are approaching the divine from different angles and eventually fuse. So we keep doing that so that our consciousness starts changing, and that is what will change the view that we have of ourselves as an individual. So while the individual self is a reality, there is a wider, deeper, and higher reality, which is the universal self. That is, the self of the cosmic self is also the same as the individual self. And then if we can add to it also the transcendent self, then we realize that the individual and the universal self is also not all. There is also a transcendent aspect to it. So it is this that is the solution to the so-called negative effects of the ego, and that is why it is looked upon as an evil. But in Aurobindo and the Madhya's Yoga, we find that you rarely kill anything. You don't kill emotions. You don't even kill the ego. We are getting released from the ego, and that essentially means release from the restricting ego sense and developing a wider, deeper, and higher view, which will take away all the negative tendencies of the ego, egoism being one of the most deadly ones. Why I said only one of the deadly ones? Because the other evils, which we sum up sometimes in our Shatripu, the 6 enemies, Kama, Krodha, Lobha, Moha, Ahankar, Matsarya, and Ahankar. Now, these are also rooted in the ego. So, as the deeper knowledge comes, they will go, and then Ahankar, which basically is the egoism, that will also go along with them. So if you just reflect back, this can be the homework. You can try and, this can be homework for today. Try and reflect how Kama, that is desires, Krodha, that is anger, Lobha, that is greed, Moha, that is attachments, and Matsarya, that is jealousy, and Ahankar, which is egoism. How all these are actually rooted in the ego or asmita, and how that is rooted in ignorance, how that ignorance can help us overcome each one of these.